The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Put Your Own Oxygen Mask On First, Care for Caregivers of Children Who Have Experienced Trauma, which is being offered as part of the ASAP Post-Conference webinar series that will be held the second Wednesday of each month through April of 2016. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a couple housekeeping items related to today's webinar. First, you will notice a Zoom viewer button in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. You can use this button to adjust the size of your webinar screen. Secondly, in the control panel located on the upper right-hand side of your screen, you will see the word Questions listed. You can use the plus and minus button to open or close this box. If you have a question for Sue, you can enter it here. Time permitting, any questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. And now I am pleased to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Sue Badeau. Sue is a nationally known speaker, writer, and consultant. She has worked for many years in child welfare, juvenile justice, children's mental health, and education, and serves on several national boards. Sue writes and speaks extensively on topics related to permanency, trauma, children with special needs, and family engagement. Sue and her husband Hector are the lifetime parents of 22 children, 2 by birth and 20 adopted. They have also served as foster parents for more than 50 children in 3 states. They have authored a book about their family's parenting journey entitled, Are We There Yet? The Ultimate Road Trip Adopting and Raising 22 Kids. Sue's book can be found on Amazon.com or her website at www.suebadeau.com. Sue, thank you for taking the time to share with us today. Welcome.
Thank you, and I'm really excited and glad to be here. You know, this is such an important topic all year round, all the time, for anyone that's in there as a professional in the workforce, or as a parent on the home front, or as I suspect many of us are in both places. It's really an important topic all the time, but it seems to be never more important than these last few weeks at the end of the year. Between end of the year work-related deadlines and the school crush of things that happen and come up at the end of the year with our children, and then all of the holidays and the extra impact that responding to the holidays has when you're caring for children who've experienced trauma, it just seems like it can be overload. And self-care is often one of the very first things that goes out the window. So I'm really delighted that you decided to host this particular webinar at this particular time, because I think it even in preparing for it was a reminder to me, oh, am I doing this? Am I taking care of myself? So I hope that all of us participating in the webinar today will not only think about how this can be useful to the folks that we care about and work with, but also for ourselves. So thanks again for inviting me to do this, and I look forward to the time that we have together. I do want to start with those who are here with me on the line with one brief poll question, so I can just get an idea of who's actually here. So that'll help me sort of adjust my comments in the best way possible to make the best use of the time. So I'm going to put up a little poll question, and I'm only going to give several seconds for those of you listening to respond to it. But like I said, it would help us get started and know who's on the call. So you will see, I hope, right now a question, and I am going to, like I said, give you about 10 or 15 seconds to respond to it, and then I'll close it out and we'll see who we have with us. Okay, about another second, and then I'm going to close it. So now I'm going to share, and you'll get to see the results here. And it does look like just about half of the people involved are people who daily interact with children or adults who've experienced trauma. So I'm thinking that means that some of you, that is probably in your own home as a caregiving parent, and for others perhaps it's in your work environment. And then it seems that another almost quarter of those on the call have regular interaction on some basis with children and adults who've experienced trauma. So I'm definitely going to gear my remarks for people who do have those regular interactions. I do see that nearly a quarter of the folks on the call supervise people who have those kind of roles, and I believe that everything that I talk about today will be relevant to you as well, and I may slip in a few comments there specifically for supervisors. But we'll go ahead and we'll hide that poll, and we'll go ahead and move on to get ourselves underway here with our next slide. So this is a little opening exercise that when I do this session live with people in a live audience, I often have folks break up in small groups and do. We can't do that format here in a webinar, but I wanted to include this anyway and share with you the value of this. So as you can see, this is an activity called a community meeting, and it's often used at the opening of any gathering of people. So I want to talk to you a little bit about it, and then about the value of this exercise, and suggest ways that you can use it in your everyday lives, because this is a tool, like others that I will share as we go through our time together, that really is very trauma-informed and helps us to be better attuned and caring as we care for people who've experienced trauma, but again, also begins to help us think about caring for ourselves. So as you look at the surface of these questions, what is your name? What is one goal you have for today? What is one success you've had in the last 7 days? I would even encourage you to actually, jot down some of your own answers to that if you'd like. But as you look at that, you may think, yeah, that's a sort of typical icebreaker type of conversation that you would have in a workshop. Surely it can fulfill that role. But I'd like you to just walk with me as we dig a little deeper into it. I want you to think of this from a trauma-informed perspective, the value of asking or being asked these particular questions from a trauma-sensitive and trauma-informed perspective. So let's start with the first question. What is your name? When you ask someone their name, you're recognizing them as an individual. When someone asks you, what is your name, they're recognizing you as an individual person, not just as a nameless number in a larger group. It also gives you the opportunity to answer in any way you wish. Even if you have a name tag on in the circumstance where you're being asked, you can say, oh, my name tag says Susan, but nobody calls me that. Please call me Sue. Or my name tag says doctor, but I don't want you to call me Dr. So-and-so. Or whatever it may mean, you can answer in any way you wish. So it does have a little bit of an empowering mechanism behind it. For children or adults who've experienced trauma, one of the first things that happens, one of the first losses they experience, is that sense of a loss of identity. They lose themselves. And to some extent, that is of necessity. It's a survival mechanism. They not only lose themselves, but they lose their sense of self, and they actually become invisible. They begin to believe that, in fact, they are invisible. And that, again, is a survival strategy, particularly for children who've experienced various kinds of trauma, such as sexual trauma. Being invisible is a safety precaution. It's certainly not intentional or cognitively thought out, but it is psychologically a tool that occurs in the brain to help as a protective factor. So when you ask someone, what is your name, you're not only saying that you're an individual to me, you're a person, and I'm empowering you to answer, but you're saying, I see you. You're not invisible. You're real. You have an identity. And that's incredibly valuable and important for anyone who's experienced trauma. And the final point I would make on that first question is that in order to answer that question, you have to be in the present tense. That is a question that requires you to be present in the moment. What is your name right now? Who are you right now today? Again, for people who have experienced trauma, including secondary trauma, which is a lot of what we'll be talking about in this topic of self-care, it's often very difficult to be present in the moment. And yet that is one of the most valuable techniques, both for caring for others and caring for ourselves, is to be able to be mindful, aware, and present in the present moment. So we're giving that gift of sort of identity. You're not invisible, you have value, you have individuality, and I'm asking you to be present in the present moment. That's a gift we give to someone every time we ask that simple question, what is your name? Or when it's asked of us. Moving on to the next question, we also have, what is one goal you have for today? Now you might think that by asking what is one goal you have for today, we're continuing in the present moment. But actually, this is a future-oriented question. Even the end of today is in the future. It hasn't happened yet. It might be a small, bite-sized piece of the future, but it actually still is in the future. So this question begins to say, let's not only be present in the present moment, but let's look ahead with some sense of expectation, hopeful expectation towards the future. But towards a small enough piece of the future, just the end of the day today, that it's believable and manageable even if we're in that whirlwind of trauma or secondary trauma. And it's one goal. Not what are all your goals, what is everything you hope to accomplish, what's everything on your checklist that you need to check off. No, it's simply what is one goal you have for today. Again, for people who have experienced trauma, not only do they lose their sense of self and identity, but they often lose a sense of any hope for a future. One child that I was working with once in a project at a school, this was in a third grade classroom where I was a volunteer, the assignment was to draw a picture of Philadelphia, that's the city where I live, to draw a picture of Philadelphia the way it's going to look when you're a grown-up. That was the assignment that the children had. And all of the children were busily coloring and drawing except one little girl. So I walked over to her and just kind of knelt down gently beside her and was present with her for a moment and said, do you need some ideas? Do you need some help to get started? And she said no. And the more I sort of tried to reframe how I was talking to her, she just kept saying no. And then finally she said, I'm not going to live to grow up, so why should I do this stupid exercise? Now, this was not a child with a terminal illness. This was not a child who anyone, to my knowledge, had given any reason, outward reason or, concrete type of reason to believe that she wasn't going to live to grow up. But this was a child who lived in a community that was plagued and riddled by violence and gunshots and drug deals and everything going on continuously every day. In fact, the children that went to this particular elementary school had to walk to school, and her walking route took her past 3 or 4 of those little impromptu memorials that get set up on the side of the road when someone dies there, because there had been so many drive-by shootings in her neighborhood. This was a child that had been so impacted by trauma that she had no hope for a future. This is often what happens to children in foster care and adoption, and can happen to all of us as caregivers. So bringing that back to saying, yes, I do want you to think about the future, but I don't want to make it overwhelming. I don't want you to have to look ahead for the next 5 or 10 years. I just want you to look ahead for the rest of today. That is an important strategy to begin that process, that healing process that helps us to be able to believe in hope for a future. It's incredibly valuable for children that have experienced trauma, but again, also sets the tone of what we need to do for ourselves as we begin to think of this topic of self-care. So finally, about this question before moving on, you'll notice how it's worded. What is one goal you have for today? Not, do you have any goals for today or for any other day? It's very important that we're setting that expectation. I believe in you, and I believe you have goals, and I'd like to hear about at least one of them. So whereas the first question pulled you out of the realm of being invisible and helped you to become valued as a person and mindful of the present, the second question demonstrates hope. I have hope and belief in you, and I have hope and belief that you have a future. So in that same frame, let's look at the last question. What is one success you've had in the last 7 days? Now, clearly, this question takes us into the past, whereas we've looked at the present and the future in the previous two questions. This one takes us to the past. And the past can be a dark and scary place for people that have experienced trauma, and it can even be a place we don't want to go too often for people that are dealing with secondary traumatic stress, which is part of our main theme for today on our self-care topic. Children who have experienced trauma not only become invisible, as we've said before, and also lose a sense of hope for the future, but truly their past is something that they just want to not deal with and not think about. So the door to that past is often shut. And if they do think about their past at all, it can be very scary and dark, as I mentioned, a place they don't want to go, but it also can, in a way, they may be feeling convinced that, my past defines me. The negative, horrible things that have happened in my past, they define who I am. That has become my identity. So this question kind of turns that on its head. It says, yes, I want you to look at your past, not too much of it. We're not going to go dig deep in long ago and far away in your whole past. Just the last 7 days. Again, a bite-sized chunk, just like we said with the future. And again, this question is worded not, oh, have you had any success lately? But it's worded, what is one success? It's hopeful, it has expectation, it has belief. What is one success you've had in your past, even just that short piece of your past? So it turns that on its head and begins to say, I am not defined only by negativity. My past is not only a pile of bad experiences. There are some nuggets of good in there. This is adapted, as you can see at the bottom of the slide. This exercise is adapted from the work of a woman by the name of Sandra Bloom, who is a great expert and someone I really admire in the field of trauma-informed care. And her particular model is called the Sanctuary Model, which you can find a lot more information about on one of the handouts that will be posted on the website that I provided. I've adapted it for use in this type of workshop, but what I would like to add is a couple of things before we go on from this page. One is, as I've just now outlined, each of these questions has value in and of itself, but they have even more value when they're combined. When you ask all three questions in one conversation, one short conversation, you can actually do this whole conversation with a peer, a colleague, or a child in 2-3 minutes. And the value of asking all three of those questions together is that it begins to create a sense of wholeness, which is so important to the healing and self-care process. Again, just like some of the other things that I've said occur when people experience trauma, losing a sense of self, becoming invisible, losing a sense of hope, and shutting the door on the past, their lives then become fragmented. Their sense, or what little sense of self they may have, is all kind of in broken and fragmented and not integrated pieces. So having this one little conversation where you bring in something that is about the present, the future, and the past all in one conversation really begins to do some of that work around healing and wholeness and understanding ourselves as whole people and integrated people is a really important value towards healing from trauma and self-care. So while this exercise is often used in group settings, that's why it's called community meeting. It's used at the beginning of a school day. Sandra Bloom has used it in all sorts of settings, homes for the elderly and prisons and schools and universities and Head Start even. It can also be used in a family setting. Now, clearly, you know your own children's name. Hopefully, even with 22 children, I do know their names. So you're not going to ask directly, what is your name? But you can sort of make a little play on that type of question and get some of the same values. What nickname do you wish to be called today? What movie character describes how you feel today? What song or what color? Or there's lots of ways you can play with that type of a question in a home or family setting or in a peer-to-peer setting with a colleague so that you're getting the same value and the same benefit that I described without being silly and saying, what is your name, to someone who clearly knows that you know their name. But the other two questions, tell me about a goal you have today. Tell me about one of your successes that you've had lately. Really useful, valuable questions that you can make part of a routine, whether it's breakfast, morning routine, whether it's bedtime routine. These are great conversation starters within our own families, but also find a buddy, find someone that you can have this type of conversation with yourself on a regular basis. This is the beginning of developing a positive self-care strategy. And again, as Cindy and Nicole said at the beginning of our conversation, please feel free to post any questions that you might have in the question box about any of these things as we go forward, and I'll be happy to address them at the end. Let's move on. Given how you all responded to that opening poll, I think you could probably relate to this fun little cartoon here. There are only 2 times when I feel stress, day and night. I imagine that many of you can relate to that. I know that certainly there are many days and nights when I can. So what I want us to do now is just begin to look at the different types of stress that we experience. And we're going to look at stress defined in these 3 different ways: positive stress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress. If you want to learn more about these 3 types of stress, particularly as they relate to the development of children, I've also listed a website at the bottom, which is the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. Has a great deal of valuable information on all 3 of these types of stress as it relates to children. But because our topic today is about self-care, I really want to think more about these types of stress as they relate to us as adults. So let's begin by looking at the first type of stress, positive stress. I would love it if some of you could use the little chat box that is available on the right side of your screen in the webinar, and even write down, just send along some examples of things you think might be included in this category of what we refer to as positive stress. Just going to take a quick sip of my water while I give you a chance to do that if you'd like, and then I'll say a little bit more about this. The things to keep in mind about positive stress is that, first of all, it is a necessary aspect of healthy development. Positive stress is a type of stress that we need. It's a short-term type of stress, generally, and it actually provides strength. So we don't want to always avoid all forms of stress, because the kinds of stress that we call positive stress give us a competitive edge in many of our activities. When we say competitive, of course, and along with the picture I've posted, that brings to mind athletics, but it doesn't only mean in athletics. It can mean in other things related to our work, such as something like I'm doing now, giving a speech or teaching a workshop, having a presentation with your supervisor or your boss, or it can mean in your personal life goals, such as trying to get in better shape or accomplish, writing so many words a day on something that you're trying to write, or completing a painting, or getting your house clean, whatever it might be. So positive stress is a part of daily life that is necessary to healthy development. It brings about some of the physiological symptoms that occur in regular stress, but does so in a brief way. So increased heart rate, mild changes in your stress hormone levels, and so forth. So this is really important and something we don't want to avoid. Positive stress occurs when we do try to push ourselves a little out of our usual comfort zone, which is why I selected a picture of one of my sons jumping over the high bar. He was always trying to push himself to take it up another notch, another half an inch, another inch. Sometimes he would fail and fall, but he would get up and try again. That's an example of positive stress, and I encourage you all to think of examples from your own life about what is positive stress in your life. But then we move on hopefully my cursor is, there we go. Then we move on to tolerable stress. Tolerable stress is also pretty normal. There's probably not too many people generally in life, and I suspect there's not any on this call with us today, who have not actually sometimes experienced tolerable stress. This is something that is a very common human experience, and it's response to negative experiences that are kind of big. It can be as the picture indicates, maybe the breakup of a relationship. That might indicate divorce, that picture, but any kind of breakup or difficulty in a relationship, It can be loss of a job, stress related to health or finances. These are the kinds of things where the stress actually is sustained for a little longer period of time than in positive stress. And so those physiological responses are also sustained a little bit longer, and so it can at times be damaging to health and development, and relationships can sometimes be strained during this time, but relationships can also be the great buffer and can be the support network that helps us tolerate these kinds of stress, which is why they're called tolerable stresses. So while they're not necessary to live and we don't absolutely need them, on the other hand, we don't have to worry too much about definitely always avoiding them, as long as we have a good support system around us and a good way of managing them. But then that brings us finally to toxic stress. Toxic stress is also a term that really does relate to the types of trauma that we experience in our work with children in the child welfare system and in our lives living many times with those children as well. So toxic stress is extreme and prolonged. It has serious health consequences because the physiological aspects as well as the psychological aspects linger for a very long time. And most people cannot sort of pull themselves up and out of toxic stress without some kind of outside supports and perhaps interventions. Toxic stress really is where the impact of secondary traumatic stress, which we'll be, like I said, talking about the rest of our time together, and it can be debilitating. The sustained stressors can create lasting change in our outlook and in our coping skills. So we definitely want to be looking for and seeking help when we know that we've experienced toxic stress. So the responses that we have to these kinds of stressors or to trauma are responses that are going to be influenced both by personal experience, history, and culture. So let's just look at the different types of trauma briefly. Everyone can experience trauma, as this illustration shows: children, adults, families as a group, and communities as a group. So each of those sort of boxes around the outside of the circle demonstrate who can experience trauma. And then the circle with the arrow that shows the fluidity of these different types of trauma shows the different kinds of trauma that we can experience. Acute trauma being that sort of one-time thing, so whether your house is broken into, it can be very dramatic, surviving a shooting, things like that, or it can be milder, surviving a mild car accident, something like that, but it's more of a one-time thing. Chronic traumas are things that happen again and again and again, but are not necessarily caused or created by our caregiving adults in our life. So chronic stressors and traumas might be being bullied at school, or having a chronic health condition where you have to have lots of intrusive types of care. Then we have complex, I'm skipping secondary for a moment, we have complex trauma, which for children means it's sort of the combination. It is chronic, it's repeated, it's multiple traumatic episodes, but it's also either caused by or not mitigated by the impact of the adult caregiver. So that is abuse or neglect directly at the hands of a parent or caregiver, or living in a domestic violence type of situation. Then we have secondary trauma, and we'll define it a bit more in a few moments, but secondary trauma really is what happens when we are not the direct recipient of those other forms of trauma, but we're exposed to it on a rather regular basis. So these are the various types of trauma. I'm going to just take a moment to define child trauma, because it's caring for children who've experienced trauma that defines our role as caregivers for the purpose of this session. Child trauma, some key and important words here are: child trauma is the child's responses. So that word response is very important. Physical and emotional responses. So child trauma is the child's physical and emotional responses to events that threaten the child's life or the life of someone important to the child. Now, it doesn't matter if the threat is real in an objective, outside observer way. It means if that's how they experience the situation. So if a child lives through domestic violence, if a child lives through a home where there's a lot of abuse, but they're not the actual abuse victim, maybe it's a sibling who's taking the brunt of the abuse. If it's a child who lives through lots of community violence, these are situations where they can still feel pretty frequently that their life is being threatened, even if it's objectively perhaps not. So that's the kind of thing that relates to child trauma. It's also important to understand that the things we term in child welfare neglect rise to this level. And so children who experience neglect of their physical needs, psychological needs, or affection and relational needs can experience that as life-threatening, and therefore it can cause a traumatic response in them. Next, there's another way that we respond to trauma, and that is historic trauma. And here you see some examples in pictures. And here you see some of those same things depicted in words. But historic trauma has to do, one of the definitions of historic trauma is that it's the community-wide and often multi-generational response of a family or community to massive cataclysmic events. So all of those types of events that we see, as I said, depicted here or on the previous slide, these are massive cataclysmic events. And so therefore they impact not only the immediate recipients of that trauma or the people who immediately experience it themselves, but the impact of that trauma can be in fact felt for multiple generations. And the importance of understanding this is a wonderful quote from Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who really is a leading expert on this topic of historic trauma. And you certainly want to read more of her stuff if that's your area of interest. But as she describes, it's not about dredging up and staying stuck in the past. That's certainly not what we want to do, or even make excuses for people's behavior based on the past. But it's about starting a healing process to let go of that past, that collective trauma, and then move forward. And the reason I make a point of bringing this in before we move on, as you see we will in just a moment, to our work on secondary trauma, is that sometimes people who go into our field of child welfare or who become foster or adoptive or kinship caregiving parents, we may have our own personal history of trauma, or we may come from a family or a community that has a historic and multi-generational history of trauma. Sometimes it's that very life experience that actually motivates and inspires us to come into this field. So I believe that we have a higher proportion of people in our field and in our work who have these previous life experiences than what we might find in many other professional fields. And so it's important to know that about ourselves, as Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart says in this quote, because that's the only way we can let go of it and move forward. So some of the self-care that we need for ourselves may not only be about the experience we have caring for, living with, or being part of a family or a workforce that frequently interacts with children and adults who've experienced trauma or supervising them, but it may be something in our own history that we have to address and sort of bring out to the surface and be open about, so that we can let go of that and have that healing process. So that's an important understanding for us if we're going to do a good job with self-care. But now let's really move into this topic of self-care as it relates to our experience with secondary traumatic stress, STS. You might see it written at times. You might also see it called vicarious trauma or vicarious traumatization. Sometimes it's also referred to as compassion fatigue. So there are a number of ways that it is described. Basically, the sort of understood definition for secondary trauma is that it's secondary traumatic stress. It's the type of stress we experience from helping or wanting to help people who have life histories of traumatic stress. Helping or even wanting to help. Sometimes we feel that we want to help, but we don't know what to do, or we can't. So if we're helping or wanting to help, we may experience secondary traumatic stress. And then when we do that repeatedly, day in, day out, over and over, we may reach this point where it becomes cumulative. At this point, I'd like to go ahead and ask a second poll question and get you involved in answering it. So let's see, I'm going to open the poll here, and I'm going to find the next. I'm going to ask your thoughts about a definition of secondary traumatic stress. So the poll is open. I'm going to give you about 15 seconds if you would please respond to this question, and then we'll close the poll. I see that about half of you have voted, so I'm going to give about another 10 or 15 seconds, but then I will close it out. Okay, more than 3/4 of you have participated, so about 2 more seconds in case anyone was ready to hit click, and then we'll close it up. Alrighty, here we go. So I've closed it, and now I'm going to share it so you can see the results. And I see that the majority, a significant majority of those of you who did reply picked the third answer, that it can be debilitating when not acknowledged and then supported and helped. And that's absolutely right. Secondary traumatic stress can have a cumulative, transformative effect, which can be just as debilitating as if you experienced the trauma yourself. I do see that a fairly significant number of you selected the first response, and that is when you have trauma and then something else happens. And that's a very common understanding or thought process about what secondary trauma is. Certainly, when you have trauma and then something else happens, you again experience trauma. You're more perhaps susceptible to those next things that happen as being trauma triggers for yourself. And in our field, some of this can all get blurred together, whether you had your own trauma history and then something else happens, or whether you the trauma and stress you're experiencing comes from being around others. But there is a slight nuance in the difference in the definition there. And so really the definition does have to do with the stress and the experience of that stress that you have. And again, it can be cumulative and it can be transformative when you help or wish to help, and when you're constantly interacting with others who have experienced trauma. So I'm going to go ahead and hide that now so we can move on. So the most important thing we can do when we recognize that we are the person who has experienced that secondary traumatic stress, is that we have to learn how to put our own oxygen mask on first. Now, clearly, if any of you have ever flown, you know where that saying comes from on the airline when they're giving the safety instructions. But really, when you are traveling with a child or an elderly person or a person with a disability, the instinctual response, particularly if you are a caregiving kind of personality, the instinctual response is, I got to take care of this other person. I got to take care of this child or my mom or this person with a disability before I think about myself. That is so in our nature. It is so normal not to think of ourselves first. Of course, the drawback is that then we lose oxygen, we can't breathe, and we become no good to anyone. So in that context, it's very clear, but we need to apply that context to our own lives as caregivers as well. If we literally lose our oxygen and are unable to breathe, we will be no good to anyone else that we're trying to care for. In the trauma world, we often talk about the 3 pillars of trauma-informed care. These are important things to provide when caring for children or others who've experienced trauma, but they're important things to provide for ourselves. So we have to look at these 3 pillars not only in how am I helping ensure that the children or adults that I work with or care for have these, and for supervisors, I would really emphasize for you the importance of this as you work with and supervise folks, asking, do they have all 3 of these pillars in place? And for those of you who interact regularly with children or adults who've experienced trauma, if some of the people you interact with, if you're a caseworker interacting with caregiving parents, again, look at the caregivers. Do they have all 3 of these pillars in place? both physical and psychological safety, genuine connections, people that are consistent and lasting in their own lives or your own life when you're thinking about this for your own self-care, and healthy emotional management tools and skills. So these, again, are three of the things we need to work on supporting in the children we care for, but in ourselves, in the caregiving parents that care for children in the child welfare system, and in our workers when we are the supervisors. And it's just important to remember that everything is linked to that trauma experience, feelings, thoughts, and behaviors, and that there's also a critical mind and body connection that often people begin to lose the ability to recognize or understand. So a self-care plan involves both our mind, and by mind I'm really incorporating cognitive, spiritual, psychological, all of that, and body. And we have to understand, pay attention to, and respond to all of those areas. So as we're thinking about our own self-care plan, we need to understand, well, what are the things that trigger me? What are the trauma triggers? I have a picture of pizza here because when I do a longer version of this workshop, sometimes I do a whole day class on being trauma informed. There's a story about a little boy for whom pizza was a trauma trigger for him. But whatever it is for you, recognize, what are my triggers? What are the things that really I need to pay attention to that get me a little more on edge than others? In other words, know your warning signs. I don't know how many of you on the webinar are old enough to remember the TV show Lost in Space, but I do. And there was a little boy, a character on the show named Will Robinson, and he had this robot friend that followed him around. And whenever there was danger nearby, the robot would say, "Danger, danger, Will Robinson." Wouldn't it be great if we had that? If we had something in our life that was giving us that instant warning mechanism when we were facing the danger of being overloaded on trauma, and yet we don't. So we have to learn how to recognize our own warning signals. There's a really wonderful video that's been made, a documentary that's been made about this, and if you have time to look at it, there is a cost associated, but it's online. You can get information about it, called Caregiversfilm.com. Again, that's Caregiversfilm.com. And so that's a really rich documentary about this. But really, pay attention to, are you experiencing increased irritability, impatience? Do you have difficulty focusing and planning? Planning is very difficult when we are experiencing secondary trauma. Is your concentration diminished? Do you feel numb or detached or have sort of that laissez-faire, comme ci, comme ça, I don't care attitude? Do you have intense feelings or intrusive thoughts about trauma or trauma reminders? Sleep problems? Eating issues, either wanting to eat all the time, never wanting to eat, things like that. Increased use of stimulants or other substances, alcohol, cigarettes, even food, just to make it through the day or the week. Do you react disproportionately to situations? You know, my family had to, if you read my book, you'll come across the famous cracker incident. I was so stressed at one point in my life and wasn't dealing with it, was just pushing through and pushing through and pushing through. And then I had an explosion with my kids about who ate some crackers that I had bought, intending them to be for Thanksgiving, and the empty box I found in the trash the day before Thanksgiving. And I exploded about the crackers. Do you find yourself having those kind of disproportionate reactions to situations? Or thinking the worst in every situation? For example, if you deal with a lot of children who've been sexually abused, and then you go to the mall for shopping during the holiday season and you see a dad giving his daughter a hug or lifting her up to sit on his shoulders and giving her a piggyback, does your mind automatically think, that pervert, I wonder what he's doing, I wonder if I should make a call? You know, these are the kind of things that are warning signs that indicate that maybe a little too much trauma and stress in your life and you need some additional attention to self-care. Pay attention to your body. Your body does want to tell you something, and you do need to listen. So we need to really re-educate our mind to listen to our body. We have to have an awareness and an attunement to the physical responses and reactions we have so that we can listen to what our body is telling us. Also, this is something I teach people working with children. We have to help children do that as well. But our purpose in this session is about taking care of ourselves. So I just really want to focus. Learn to listen to your body. Learn to understand what your body is saying. Tune in to those little changes, whether they're anything from goosebumps to stomach aches to back aches. What is my body trying to tell me? We know, and again, I've given the website to the Harvard Center on the Developing Child if you want to learn more, that trauma really does change the brain, both the original kind of trauma that the child may have experienced and the secondary trauma that we have experienced. And so part of the brain in this picture that is lit up in yellow, that's the part of the brain that is that represents our thinking part of our brain. And the other picture on the left is when we're under the influence of toxic stress or trauma. You can see that the thinking part of our brain is more or less turned off. It's not just a little lighter or a little weaker. It's completely turned off. So what we really need to try to do with our trauma, with our self-care plan, is learn how to turn it back on. And one of my colleagues has developed an approach to that called SOS. We need our own SOS plan, which stands for slow down, slowing our brain down so that it can turn the thinking part back on, orient ourselves to where we are now, and then implement a safety plan. So let's just go through these one by one. The first step is slowing down. The thing that will help the thinking part of our brain turn back on and help us to be able to then actually respond in a way that is helpful and hopeful in situations where we're overly stressed is to breathe. Very simply, to breathe. So develop some breathing techniques for yourself and little tricks you can use to help yourself slow down your breathing when it starts to pick up its pace. I like to keep bottles of bubbles around, and even though little children love bubbles, they're great for adults too. Because when you try to blow a bubble, you have to make your breathing slow and controlled. But you can do counting to 10 breathing, you can do all kinds of breathing exercises. It just means learn to develop some breathing strategies you can implement for yourself. The second step in the SOS is what's called orient. When we have a stress reaction, when anyone has a stress reaction, part of what's going on is that our brain is going back to a time when we were experiencing trauma. And if it's secondary trauma, it might be taking you back to that time when you're kind of reliving the trauma that you've heard about through a child that you work with or live with. So the next thing we need to do is kind of orient ourselves. No, I'm not there. I'm not in that past situation. I'm here. It's now. I'm okay. So even just giving yourself, as indicated in the picture, just a little squeeze or a little pinch, having a rubber band on your wrist that you can snap, anything that sort of alerts your brain to re-situate itself into the present. I'm here, it's now, I'm not there, it's not then, I'm okay. And then is when we want to implement what we call our personal safety plan, our personal stress release or stress prevention toolkit. And I'm going to give you, in the next 15 minutes that we have remaining, I'm going to give you 3 ways to think about that. One is by something I call stress busters. One is by using your 5 senses, and then one is an ABC approach. But first, we're going to do one more poll here. I'd like to ask you if you actually do have your own self-care plan already. So I'm going to pose a question, and it's just a yes or no, so I'm not going to give you too long, but if you could take a few seconds and respond to that question, it'd be great. Okay, about 2/3 of you have replied. I'm going to just give about 10 more seconds for the rest of you to chime in, and then we will close this one out. Okay, I'm going to close it out, and you'll be able to see the results. As you can see, it's about 50-50, not quite, but very close to 50-50 results as to whether you do have a self-care plan or not. So kudos and congratulations to those who do. And we all can benefit from some refresher and some ways to improve on that. And for those who don't, I strongly encourage you to do that. So let's look at the elements of a self-care plan. First, it's important to understand that trauma impacts our well-being across all life domains, and so therefore we have to have a self-care plan that addresses all life domains. So the first thing I'd like to encourage you to do is have what I refer to as a personal safety plan, or a set of stress busters. I'd like you to sort of on a piece of paper, you can do this or whatever, but write down, draw 3 columns on a page and title one of them daily, one of them weekly, and then one of them sometimes. And then think through things you can do daily, weekly, and then sometimes in multiple life domain categories that help you both prevent stress and reduce stress when it creeps up on you. And when I say multiple life domains, I mean physically, emotionally, spiritually, socially. So in each of those categories, and intellectually, cognitively, I didn't mention, but in each of those categories, what is something you can do daily? What is something you can do weekly? And what is something you do whenever, sometimes when it's as needed or a rare occasion or something you can look forward to. So just to give an example, in the physical category, daily you might have a little exercise routine you do every day, or take a walk. Weekly, you might do something a little more strenuous. You might play tennis with a friend for a whole hour, or something like that. And then sometimes you might do something even more strenuous. You might go for a weekend hiking trip with people in your family or friends. So that's an example of taking that one domain, physical, and thinking of something in each of those categories. So I strongly encourage you to do that for yourself. Make yourself that chart that says, here's my daily things, here's my weekly things, here's my sometimes things, and then post it. If you use a smartphone, which most of us do these days, have it on there so you can look at it. Post it also in a non-technology way, such as on your refrigerator or on your bathroom mirror or in your bedroom or inside a book you read every day or a Bible or whatever it might be. But just have it posted in a way that you're going to look at it frequently. Because having a plan like this is great, but it's also something we're less likely to use when we need it most, unless we really have it kind of right in front of us. The next way to think about how to manage our own self-care is by using all 5 of our senses. So I want you to think about the 5 senses. I'm going to run through them now rather briefly, but for each of these 5 senses, I want you to think about what is something that I can, okay, this first one is sight, so I'm going to use that. What is something I can look at that makes me feel calm, that makes me feel relaxed, that makes me slow my breathing down? For many, it's the colors that are in this slide, blues, some greens, some lavenders, but it might be a particular person's face. It might be a waterfall. It might be a little cute cat picture. Might be a flower or a tree. Often it does have something to do with nature, but it could be people. Figure out what is the one thing that whenever I look at it, I just go, ah. And then have a small, portable piece of that picture always on your person. So again, it can be on your smartphone. It can be a little laminated wallet-sized piece that's in your wallet or in your pocket. It can be something you post on at your desk, at your computer, again, in your bedroom, on the mirror. The idea here with all 5 of these senses is cheap and accessible. We want cheap and accessible tools that help us to take care of ourselves, because we can't do things that take a lot of time, money, or investment in our kind of work and if we're caregiving for others. We just can't. So if we plan things that take a lot of time or take money or just take a little effort to kind of access, then the likelihood we're really going to use them is minimal. So I encourage you to find that one visual cue that when you look at it, it just helps you take that sigh, and then have that picture in multiple places, but in a way that you can have with you at all times. Now do the same thing with the other senses. For example, sound. for me, the sound of the ocean is definitely one that does that for me. So I actually have recorded the sound of waves coming in, and I have it on my iPhone and on my computer. It might be like, again, the sound of a waterfall. It might be the sound of a particular person's voice. It might be a certain type of music. For many, it is classical. There's some research about that. But for you, it might be jazz, or it might be rap, or it might be country western. Again, find what that sound is. I've worked with lots of people over the years on this, and I've found some interesting things. One man said the sound that works for him is the sound of a vacuum cleaner. Another person said it was the sound of their washing machine. Find the sound that works for you, record it, and have it always accessible. And again, with the types of phones we have these days, it's easier than ever to do. Then, again, do the same thing. Oops, there you go. I forgot that I actually had it recorded here. So you can actually hear the sound that I was speaking of. Do the same, all right, how do I get us to the next slide? There we go. Do the same thing with touch. What is something that you can have? Again, pocket-sized, cheap, accessible. Is it something soft and fleecy, like a little square of a fleece blanket? Or do you need something that sort of stimulates your senses, something that's rough to the touch, like the sandpaper on the left-hand side? Find something you can touch that will immediately restore you to calm when you're starting to get overly stressed. Do the same with scent. Especially do it with scent. It's the most important. Of all the 5 senses, this is the one that is most reactive as a trigger for trauma, but luckily it's also the most reactive as something that helps bring soothing and calm. So there's research about this, and there are certain scents, especially lavender, vanilla, cinnamon, bergamot, chamomile, eucalyptus, sage, that are known to bring about sense of restoration and calm for many people. So certainly that gives you a list of something to start with. But if that doesn't work for you, then find what works for you. Find the scent that suits you. One time I found a person I was working with, and the scent that really worked for him was turpentine. Ugh, that wouldn't make me feel calm. But then when I learned his story, I learned why. You see, he had grown up in a home where there was domestic violence, and he had hid in a closet when that was going on. And in that closet were paint rags that smelled of turpentine. And so to him, that signifies safety. And so even now as an adult, smelling turpentine when he's getting stressed brings him back to a place of safety. But when you find what your scent is, just put it on a little square of something, a little sachet or a little square of cloth. Put it in a Ziploc bag. Again, cheap and accessible. You can have it with you. And if your scent happens to be something common like lavender, you can even buy actual dryer sheets like Bounce, you know, those things. Cut them up in little squares, put them in Ziploc bags. And then when you need a hit, you know, just open that baggie and take a deep, calming breath, and that will help you to restore calm. Do the same thing with taste, and for many of us, that might involve chocolate, so nothing more needs to be said there. Another thing that is known to help in a self-care plan is coloring, and there's a ton of, I've been talking about this way before it became trendy, but all of a sudden it is trendy, and it's online. You can find all kinds of articles about the soothing effects of coloring for adults. Have a coloring book, have some crayons handy that you can use, and then also painting. Go to a painting class. These paint night activities that are now out there can be loads of fun, but also very soothing and calming. So if it's not something that's already part of your daily or weekly life, it's a great piece to add to your own self-care plan. And then remembering that mind and body connection that I spoke about earlier, we have the ideas of using things like dance and yoga. And there's particularly research around the value of yoga as part of a self-care plan, but dance is also very helpful, karate and some of those other martial arts as well, things that involve a real full mind and body connection. So we went through the sort of stress busters, personal self-care plan approach of your daily, weekly, and as needed activities. We went through using your 5 senses. And then as we come to the end of our time, I just want you to always think about it this way, an ABCs of self-care. The A is for awareness. Be aware of your triggers. Be aware of the circumstances that put you in overload. And be aware of the tools that you have available to help bring you back to a restoration. Have balance in your life, mind, body, psychology, cognition, physical activities, social activities with others, calm, personal, individual activities. Have balance. But then remember that connection is so important that it's not only the C, but it's my next slide, a slide to remind us that this tool here, this tool, a jumper cable, it doesn't work. It's a useless tool when your battery is dead unless it's connected to someone whose battery is alive. And in the same way, we all need that kind of connection in our lives. So who is your support system? Who are you connected to? Spiritually, it can be through faith, but also in a human way, who are you connected to that is part of your own self-care plan? And finally, remember that our brains learn primarily through repetition. So we have to constantly focus on the positive, see the positive, and store up treasures of positive experiences in our memory. So your homework assignment, as I leave you, is to make some lists of things you like about yourself, things you like about other people, things you're thankful for, and always have things that are positive that you can focus on. So I know our time is drawing to a close. I just want to remind you that what we're building here is resilience. As we develop a self-care plan, we will be more resilient to help ourselves and, importantly, to help the others that we love and care about. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season, and thank you. If we're out of time for questions for me to answer on the call, I certainly welcome receiving them in email, and I'll respond that way.
Sue, thank you so much. And to everyone else, we hope you've enjoyed today's webinar. I'm sure many of you are working with families currently who could benefit from the information Sue has shared. As a reminder, all of the webinars have been recorded and are available on the Harmony website at www.harmonyfamilycenter.org. Please plan to join us at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, December 9th for the next ASAP post-conference webinar entitled Family Violence and Its Impact on Foster and Adopted Children, which will be presented by Deb Finley and Kai Mumpfield of the Children's Aid Society in Alabama. Until then, take care and have a great rest of the week.